There are moments in a man's life when the world tries to reach him gently, offering him a chance to pause, to feel, to listen. Yet ambition grows so loudly inside him that even destiny's whisper becomes too faint to recognize. And on this particular morning, as Anika village held its breath in the strange stillness left behind by the beggar's unanswered cry, Kelechi walked through the marketplace with the quiet certainty of someone who believed he was beyond the reach of warnings that did not fit into the plans he had already shaped for himself. Kelechi moved with the composed intensity of a man who trusted his footsteps more than the subtle signs life placed in front of him. His stride was measured, his breath controlled, and his focus locked firmly upon the town hall standing at the far end of the marketplace, a place where contracts awaited him, where elders expected him, where a new level of influence seemed ready to open its doors. His mind was already inside that room, rehearsing every persuasive word he intended to use, envisioning the nods of approval he hoped to earn, building a future one calculated thought at a time. Yet the world around him carried a different kind of energy, a quiet stir that brushed against the edges of his awareness like a warning wrapped in soft wind. The villagers could not name the feeling, but they sensed something shifting in the air, something that made conversations momentarily soften, footsteps slow, and glances drift toward the old beggar, whose cry had briefly unsettled the morning's rhythm. But Kelechi had spent so many years training his heart to ignore anything that did not contribute to his ambitions, that he no longer felt the subtle discomfort that comes when a man is walking away from a moment meant for him. He convinced himself that compassion belonged to the weak, to those who had time to waste, to people who did not understand the weight of responsibility he carried upon his shoulders. His thoughts moved in straight lines, clean, disciplined, unwavering, and those lines left no space for detours shaped by empathy or hesitation. Even as the faint echo of the beggar's trembling call brushed past him again, thin and cracked like something breaking beneath its own sadness, he allowed pride to rise within him with the practiced ease of someone who had learned to silence the softer parts of himself long ago. He tightened his grip on the leather folder tucked beneath his arm, telling himself that important men didn't stop in the middle of the street because a stranger asked them to. He reminded himself that every minute mattered, every decision counted, every distraction carried a cost he was unwilling to pay. And so he kept walking, his gaze fixed straight ahead, refusing even a single glance toward the frail hand that trembled in the air beside him. He did not see the disappointment that crossed the old man's face. He did not see the villagers exchange subtle, saddened nods as they watched a rising leader walk past a moment that could have softened him. He did not see how the sunlight dimmed slightly, as though withdrawing its warmth in response to the choice he had just made. To Kelechi, it felt like nothing, a normal, insignificant moment swallowed by the flow of a busy morning. He believed he had done the responsible thing, the wise thing, the necessary thing. But beneath the surface of that ordinary moment, something delicate shifted, something invisible, ancient, and far more consequential than he could imagine. The air behind him seemed to tighten, as though gripping the exact point in time where he had turned away, marking it quietly, sealing it into the unfolding shape of his fate. The beggar slowly lowered his trembling hand, not with anger, not with defeat, but with a knowing heaviness that came from understanding that destiny often begins with the choices people believe will never matter. And as Kelechi continued forward, unaware of the unseen eyes following him, unaware of the quiet change rippling through the morning behind him, unaware that he had just stepped over the threshold of a test far larger than the contract he was chasing, the path before him grew strangely narrow, as though the world had begun rearranging itself in response to the decision he believed harmless. He did not feel the ground shift beneath him, but destiny had already begun rewriting the consequences he was walking toward, quietly, patiently, and with a certainty he would soon be unable to outrun. The instant Kelechi disappeared into the crowd, something shifted in the marketplace with a quiet intensity that felt almost supernatural, as though the ground beneath the village had inhaled sharply, startled by the decision it had just witnessed. It was a strange, pulsing unease, rolling through the air like distant thunder that refused to reveal its source, and the people of Aniki felt it before they could understand it. An invisible ripple of tension that suggested the morning had been altered in a way none of them were prepared to explain. The beggar, still seated on the dusty ground, slowly lowered his trembling hand, the motion heavy with a disappointment so profound it seemed to settle into the air around him, like a shadow, refusing to lift. His expression carried a sorrow that did not come from being ignored, but from recognizing that a long-awaited moment had just slipped through his fingers, and the quiet collapse of that hope pressed upon him with an ache deeper than hunger or cold. A fruit seller, one of the kindest faces in the village, stepped forward cautiously, her hands trembling as she offered him a small cup of water, her voice barely above a whisper as she tried to comfort him. But when the old man looked up and met her eyes, there was something in his gaze that unsettled her, something ancient, tired, and powerful, and his reply chilled her more than the morning breeze ever could as he murmured, "The one who was meant to hear did not." The words slipped through the marketplace like a quiet omen, threading themselves into hushed conversations and cautious glances, spreading with the steady persistence of a truth too important to ignore. Villagers who had barely noticed the beggar moments ago now found themselves drawn into uneasy speculation, murmuring among themselves about the stories they had heard in passing. Stories of a stranger who appeared in distant villages without anyone seeing him arrive. Stories of a man who seemed to walk between places rather than through them. Stories of someone whose presence was followed by events no one could easily explain. The market, usually filled with laughter and noise, took on a softer tone as people exchanged concerned looks, uncertain whether to fear the old man or fear what his words might mean. Even the children, whose curiosity often overpowered their caution, kept a distance from the beggar, sensing something otherworldly in the quiet around him. They watched him from behind baskets and clay pots, whispering stories of their own, noticing how the shadows near him seemed to stretch differently, how his stillness felt too deliberate, how even the birds on the rooftops remained oddly quiet when he moved. There was an unspoken agreement among them that this was no ordinary morning, and certainly no ordinary man, and that whatever had happened between him and Kelechi carried a significance they were too young to understand, but wise enough to fear. The beggar's breathing steadied as he placed a trembling hand on the ancient staff beside him, the wood etched with markings that looked more like memories than carvings. He pushed himself upward with a strength that did not match the weakness of his body, rising slowly but with an unmistakable sense of purpose guiding every motion. Those nearest to him instinctively stepped back, not out of fear for themselves, but out of respect for something they could not name, something that demanded quiet reverence, even without asking for it. His posture straightened in a way that suggested determination rather than defiance, as though he was not preparing to confront anyone, but to fulfill a duty that had waited far too long for him to rise. He took a single step forward, then another, each one measured and deliberate, his staff tapping gently against the ground with a rhythm that felt like an old prayer returning to life. The villagers watched in breathless silence, sensing that the old man was moving toward something inevitable, something that had been set into motion long before this morning. The fruit seller clasped her hands anxiously, whispering a quiet plea for the man she had just watched walk away from a moment meant for him. But the beggar did not look at anyone as he moved. His gaze remained fixed on the distant outline of the town hall, the very place Kelechi had rushed toward with pride in his steps and certainty in his heart. And as the beggar began making his way toward that hall, the air around him thickened with a quiet tension that spread through the marketplace in slow waves, leaving behind a sense of anticipation, that made even the bravest hearts uneasy. Not a single villager dared to follow him, for they sensed that whatever awaited inside that hall was meant only for the one who had ignored the cry, and the one now walking toward him with a purpose no one could afford to misunderstand. Inside the town hall, an unsettling chill drifted through the open windows as though the air itself carried a message too heavy for mortal ears, and it settled across the polished wooden floor with a stillness that felt eerily deliberate, the kind of silence that only arrives when something greater, older, and more powerful than human intention is drawing near. The room seemed to pulse with an invisible tension, a quiet reminder that the boundary between the seen and unseen had thinned, waiting for one man to realize what he was about to face. Kelechi entered the hall with the confident composure of a man certain that today would mark another step upward in his carefully crafted journey, unaware that the atmosphere inside the room had already shifted in response to the choice he had made moments earlier. The elders seated around the carved oak table exchanged uneasy glances as he approached, their hands resting stiffly on rolled-up documents and inked agreements, yet their attention seemed less focused on the contract they had summoned him to finalize, and more on the strange heaviness hanging in the air. One elder in particular, known for the quiet intuition that had guided the village through storms seen and unseen, continued glancing toward the entrance with a tension that deepened each time the wind pressed against the door, as though he sensed footsteps drawing closer, even before they touched the stone path outside. When Kelechi sat before them, the elder leaned forward with a solemn expression, his voice steady, but weighed with concern as he murmured, "You crossed paths with someone you should not have dismissed," a statement that hung in the air like a haunting truth begging to be acknowledged. But Kelechi, bound tightly to his ambition and accustomed to brushing aside anything that threatened to slow him, forced a polite smile and dismissed the warning with the ease of someone who believed such spiritual caution belonged to a world he had outgrown. To him, success was built through discipline, through intellect, through relentless focus, not through superstition whispered by elders whose wisdom he respected but no longer fully valued. He allowed himself to chuckle softly, calling it an unnecessary concern, insisting that his morning had been uneventful, though part of him, a very small buried part, felt a faint discomfort at the memory of the trembling hand he had ignored on the roadside. The elders exchanged another glance, their unease deepening, for the shadows cast by the lanterns seemed to stretch longer across the floor, bending in unnatural angles as though reacting to something approaching from beyond the hall. Outside, the sun dimmed slightly beneath passing clouds, and a hush swept across the courtyard, where moments earlier, laughter had spilled freely from the villagers moving about their day. Now conversations softened, footsteps slowed, and eyes drifted toward the far end of the courtyard, where a lone figure emerged with the steady, deliberate steps of someone who carried more than age in his bones. The beggar's silhouette, frail yet strangely commanding, appeared against the fading light, and though no sound escaped his lips, the very sight of him seemed to send a vibration through the ground, a quiet tremor that brushed beneath the feet of those who watched. A fruit seller paused mid-motion, her breath hitching as she recognized the same old man who had whispered an unsettling truth only moments before, and the guards stationed at the hall's entrance straightened instinctively, without understanding why. Inside, the dread grew thicker, pressing into the hall with each heartbeat, and even Kelechi, so focused on his contract and the promise of greater influence, felt a fleeting unease whisper across his chest, like a warning he could not name. Yet he forced his attention back to the documents before him, determined not to allow distraction or doubt to interfere with the progress he believed was within reach. But the moment the beggar placed his first foot upon the stone steps leading to the hall, an unseen force trembled through the building's wooden beams, subtle yet undeniable, stirring the lantern flames and drawing the attention of every elder seated around the table. and as the old man took another step forward, the tremor deepened, signaling that whatever had followed Kelechi into this day was no longer waiting outside. It was coming directly for him. The guards tensed as the frail beggar drifted toward the entrance of the town hall, with the slow, deliberate certainty of someone carrying a purpose older than the walls he approached. And in that moment, the air thickened with a force that neither man nor weapon could name, making even the polished metal of their armor feel strangely weightless. It was as though the very atmosphere recognized him, bending subtly out of his way, warning the guards that their strength and the authority they served were far too small to hinder what was coming. The old man's steps echoed across the courtyard with a rhythm that defied his fragile appearance, each one landing with a quiet authority that drew the attention of every villager within sight. There was something unsettling, yet mesmerizing about the way he carried himself, leaning on his ancient staff as though using it to balance the weight of something unseen rather than the weakness of age. The guards, seasoned men who had stood at that hall's entrance through storms, disputes, and celebrations, felt an inexplicable nervousness crawl through their chests as the beggar drew closer. They had faced thieves, drunkards, and countless villagers seeking favor, but none had approached with the aura that wrapped itself around this frail figure, like a cloak woven from mystery. When he reached the foot of the stone steps, the wind sharpened, swirling around him with an icy whisper that lifted the edges of his tattered cloth as if bowing to him. Before either guard could raise a hand or demand his purpose, a sudden cold wind sliced between them, rattling their spears against their palms and leaving a fine tremor in their joints. The beggar lifted his staff with a slow, unwavering motion, and the carved symbols along its surface seemed to catch the fading sunlight in a way that made the wood appear alive. For a brief moment, the world seemed suspended, holding its breath in anticipation of what would happen next. Then, in a voice so soft it should have vanished into the breeze, but instead pressed firmly into their minds, the beggar spoke a single word: "Allow." The command was not loud, nor threatening, yet it carried a resonance that bypassed every instinct to resist. It felt less like a request, and more like an instruction from something beyond their understanding, and without knowing why, the guards' tension melted away. Their bodies moved independently of their will, their spears lowering, their shoulders easing, their feet shifting aside as though guided by unseen hands. They did not sense fear, nor were they compelled by intimidation. They were responding to a force that felt natural, inevitable, and strangely honorable. The villagers witnessing the scene felt a shiver run through them as they saw two strong guards, men known for their discipline, step aside for a beggar without a single argument or hesitation, and the shock of it spread through the like a quiet gasp. None dared to voice. The beggar ascended the steps without looking left or right, his attention fixed entirely on the heavy wooden, something about unsettling and strangely grand, as though centuries of unspoken order were being quietly rewritten in that single moment. And then, with a slow, deliberate stillness that felt more powerful than any announcement, the heavy doors began to swing shut behind him, the sound echoing across the courtyard, like a drumbeat, signaling the beginning of something irreversible. And as those doors closed fully, sealing the beggar inside, the air trembled with a force that warned every watching soul that nothing within that hall would remain unchanged once he finished what he had come to do. The moment the beggar appeared in the doorway, time seemed to stretch itself thin, pulling every sound, breath, and heartbeat into a stillness so profound. It felt as though the entire hall had become a vessel, waiting for truth to pour into it. It was not simply a man standing at the threshold. It was the arrival of something larger than the room, larger than the authority gathered within it, a presence so quiet yet commanding that even the beams of sunlight filtering through the tall windows seemed to hesitate before daring to fall upon him. The elders, men who had weathered decades of leadership, who had faced storms disputes, and decisions that shaped the village, found themselves rising instinctively from their seats, their disbelief painted across their lined faces as they struggled to reconcile the frailty of the figure before them with the power that accompanied his entrance. The beggar did not stride confidently. He moved with measured humility, each step slow and deliberate, yet the weight of his presence folded into the room like a force that had long been expected, though none had known when it would arrive. Kelechi's confident posture faltered as his gaze locked onto the old man, confusion flickering across his features as a cold ripple passed through his chest, stirring an unease he had tried to ignore since morning. His certainty wavered, and in that brief crack of doubt, something within him recognized that the moment unfolding was beyond the boundaries of ambition and beyond anything he had prepared for. The beggar's voice, thin, frail, yet somehow carrying an echo that did not belong to the small chamber, filled the hall as though the walls themselves leaned forward to carry his words. "I cried out to you this morning," he said, his tone neither angry nor pleading, but layered with a sorrow older than memory, "and you chose not to hear." The statement drifted through the space with a clarity that pierced deeper than accusation, touching the edges of the elders' hearts with both fear and reverence. A few of them lowered their eyes, recognizing something divine behind the trembling figure. They had seen enough in their lifetimes to understand when a human form hid something far more ancient, something that belonged to realms where judgment and mercy intertwined with fate. Kelechi tried to steady himself, forcing a breath into lungs that suddenly felt too tight, and attempted to shape an explanation, something about urgency, something about responsibility. But the words could not find form. His mind scrambled for logic, for control, for the confidence he had walked in with, yet every thought dissolved the moment he met the beggar's gaze. There was no accusation in those eyes, no bitterness, no earthly anger. Instead, he saw a depth that made his spirit tremble, a depth that revealed how small even the greatest human ambition truly was. The beggar lifted a hand, trembling with age, yet commanding with an authority that silenced Kelechi's excuses before they could escape his lips. At that gesture, the entire hall fell into absolute silence, a silence so full and heavy that it seemed to press gently into every corner, demanding acknowledgement, demanding stillness, demanding humility. The elders bowed their heads, not out of fear, but reverence, understanding instinctively that they were standing in the presence of a messenger who had stepped into their world, wearing the simple disguise of human frailty. Even the guards outside felt an odd pressure, a quiet weight that reached them through the closed doors, as though the force inside the hall had begun to reshape the space beyond its walls. Kelechi felt the silence wrap around him like a cold mantle, and in that chilling stillness, he realized that the decision he had made earlier, the one he believed so harmless, had carried consequences he had never imagined. He felt as though he were standing on the edge of a precipice, waiting to see what judgment or revelation would meet him when he fell. The beggar stepped farther into the hall, and as he did, the faint shadows cast by the lantern flames began to ripple, shifting subtly as though responding to an unseen current that flowed around him. The air grew denser, almost luminous, charged with a presence that felt too pure, too ancient, too unearthly to belong to the human realm. The elders exchanged nervous glances, sensing something extraordinary awakening within the room. Kelechi stared, unable to move, feeling the invisible veil between the natural and the divine begin to thin, trembling beneath the weight of a truth he hadn't been prepared to face. And then, as the beggar paused at the center of the hall, the air around him began to shimmer with a strange, unearthly light, signaling that the truth he carried was about to reshape everything Kelechi thought he understood. A soft glow began to rise from the beggar's skin, subtle at first like a faint shimmer warming the air, but within seconds, it intensified into a radiance so fierce and ancient that it stung the eyes of everyone in the hall, forcing even the bravest to look away in startled disbelief. It was as though the frailty he had carried moments ago, the trembling limbs, the bent spine, the quivering voice, was shedding itself layer by layer, revealing something beneath that did not belong to weakness, time, or mortality, something that felt as old as the earth and as commanding as the sky. The transformation unfolded with a grace that both terrified and humbled those who witnessed it. The beggar's curved back straightened slowly, not with the stiffness of healing bones, but with the effortless elegance of a being reclaiming its true form. His joints, once fragile, aligned with a kind of quiet authority, and the tremor in his hands faded until each movement carried a precision that suggested power rather than age. The ragged cloth that had clung to him like a memory of suffering dissolved into a soft glow, threads unraveling into particles of light that floated momentarily in the air before weaving themselves into radiant garments laced with symbols older than the village, older than any scripture the elders had ever studied, symbols that whispered of realms beyond human understanding. His eyes, once clouded by time and hardship, now blazed with a brilliance so pure and intense that no mortal gaze could meet them for more than a heartbeat. It was not the brightness of fire, nor the luminescence of stars. It was a kind of truth manifesting through light, a gaze that saw through bodies, through hearts, through intentions, stripping away every pretense and exposing the soul with a clarity that felt both terrifying and merciful. The elders, men of wisdom and resilience, fell to their knees in trembling reverence, their breaths caught in their throats as they realized they were no longer standing in the presence of a beggar, but before a messenger, a celestial envoy whose arrival had been hidden beneath the humility of human form. Kelechi stood frozen, a helpless witness to the unraveling of everything he believed he understood about the world. His breath caught sharply as realization crashed over him. He had walked past this being without a glance, without acknowledgement, without compassion, blind to the divine test disguised in human need. Every assumption he had made about strength, success, and importance felt suddenly small in comparison to the magnitude of what stood before him. His heart thudded violently in his chest, not from fear alone, but from the crushing weight of truth. The truth that he had failed a test he never knew he was taking, a test that judged not his intellect or ambition, but the softness of his humanity. Then the divine messenger spoke, and his voice resonated through the hall with a sound that felt like thunder wrapped in silk, loud without shouting, commanding without aggression, ancient without age. You have been weighed and found wanting. The words carried no anger, no contempt. Instead, they were heavy with a sorrow that suggested the messenger had hoped for a different outcome, had hoped Kelechi would choose compassion over pride, humility over haste, humanity over ambition. Yet the truth stood unaltered, echoing through the hall with the finality of a verdict written long before the moment it was spoken. The air vibrated softly with each syllable, and Kelechi felt the weight of those words settle into his chest like a stone, pushing out every defense, every excuse, every justification he might have offered. The elders lowered their heads further, knowing that divine judgment was never spoken without purpose, and that whatever would follow next would carry consequences far beyond the walls of their council chamber. Shadows along the floor tightened, as though bracing themselves for something enormous preparing to awaken, and even the very light in the room seemed to retreat slightly, awaiting the next revelation. Then the messenger lifted his radiant hand, and in the breathless silence that followed, he pronounced a judgment powerful enough to shatter the world Kelechi believed was unshakable. The hall dimmed as if the sun had stepped back from its own light, withdrawing its warmth from the chamber as though unwilling to witness what was about to unfold, and in that unnatural dimness, Kelechi felt a pressure grip his chest, an invisible weight that did not touch skin or bone, but reached deeper than breath, deeper than heartbeat, settling directly upon his spirit with the suffocating heaviness of truth long avoided. It was the presence of the unseen world, vast and ancient, closing in around him with the solemn promise that whatever came next would be irreversible. The divine messenger stood at the center of the hall, with a glow that pulsed like a heartbeat of pure radiance, neither harsh nor gentle, but overwhelmingly alive. When he spoke, the room did not tremble from noise, but from meaning, for his voice carried a sorrow that felt older than the village, older than mountains, older than the stories handed down through generations. A man who rejects compassion rejects the very blessing he seeks, he declared. And though the words were spoken softly, they pressed outward with the force of a truth that no human defense could withstand. The elders, whose duties were guided by tradition, instinctively lowered their heads, understanding that divine justice was not something one argued, negotiated, or reasoned with. It was something one received, humbly, fearfully, and without the illusion of escape. Kelechi, however, was not prepared for the spiritual weight those words carried. His breath stumbled, his jaw tightened, and his mind scrambled desperately for explanations that suddenly sounded feeble even to his own ears. He insisted he had acted out of urgency, insisting that responsibility demanded discipline, that progress required focus, that he had not meant to harm nor insult anyone. But his words were hollow, brittle, shattering beneath the quiet gaze of the messenger, who saw not the polished exterior of a rising leader, but the raw truth, the truth of a heart that had forgotten gentleness in the pursuit of glory. When the messenger responded, his voice carried no anger, no accusation, only an agonizing clarity that cut deeper than any rebuke. Power without kindness is corruption. Wealth without mercy is rot. The statement lingered in the air like a final verdict, echoing through the wooden beams above and settling into the floor beneath their feet. A sudden gust of wind surged through the hall, extinguishing every lamp, plunging the chamber into a darkness so complete that even the memory of light felt distant. It was not the darkness of night, nor the darkness of fear. It was the darkness of revelation, the kind that forces the soul to confront its own reflection without the disguise of circumstance or excuse. The elders clasped their robes tightly, trembling not from cold, but from awe, for they knew the moment a divine messenger extinguished the light of a room, it meant judgment had begun its descent. Kelechi felt the fear settle deeper, threading itself through his chest like a tightening cord, each breath becoming a reminder that something unseen had entered the space between who he thought he was and who he truly was. The silence that followed was unbearable, stretching endlessly, as though time itself refused to move until it had finished weighing everything he carried. His pride, his ambition, his choices, and the single moment of compassion he had denied that morning. He stood in that darkness, stripped of certainty, unable to hide behind eloquence or authority, and for the first time in years, he felt small. Not from weakness, but from the realization that he had placed himself above the very principles he claimed to honor. The messenger did not move, yet the air around him shifted with the slow, deliberate power of something sacred unfolding. Kelechi sensed it before he saw it, the subtle unraveling of the world he had worked so hard to build, not physically, not visibly, but spiritually, like threads loosening from a fabric long overdue for examination. He felt his confidence waver, his ambition flicker, his pride crumble inside the silence, as though an unseen hand was peeling away the layers he had wrapped around himself for protection. In that unraveling, the truth emerged with painful clarity. The cost of ignoring a moment of compassion was far greater than he had ever imagined, and the consequences were no longer waiting in the distance. They were already here, standing in the same room, preparing to reshape his life in ways he could not predict. And it was in that crushing silence, with the darkness thick around him, that Kelechi felt the first quiet tear in the foundation of everything he had ever built. a warning that the judgment now descending would reach far deeper than his reputation, all the way into the core of who he believed himself to be. News of Kelechi's unraveling spread across the region faster than fire skimming across dry thatch carried by the harmattan winds. But unlike ordinary fire that consumes everything in its path, this destruction seemed to curve deliberately around the world and aim itself solely at him, isolating him within a storm he never imagined he would face. It was as though the universe had taken one small moment, the one he thought insignificant, and stretched its consequences across every part of his life with the quiet precision of justice, finally awakening to claim its due. In the days that followed the divine judgment inside the hall, the life Kelechi had crafted so carefully began dissolving with a speed that left him breathless. His business partners, men who once praised his brilliance and insisted they trusted him above all others, suddenly withdrew from their agreements without explanation, their polite smiles thinning into wary glances whenever he approached. Investors who had once competed for his attention now avoided meetings entirely, sending vague messages about unexpected risks and necessary re-evaluations, though none could clearly name what had changed. Contracts that were once considered unshakable collapsed with baffling ease, as though the ink that sealed them had never carried weight. Kelechi watched helplessly as his achievements, built through years of sleepless nights and unwavering discipline, crumbled like brittle clay exposed to rain for the first time. Rumors rose silently at first, whispered behind doors and beneath breath, but soon they tangled themselves through the village like creeping vines, staining his reputation with shadows he could not see but felt deeply. People spoke of misfortune following him, of unseen forces that had stepped away from him, of destiny withdrawing its support the moment he ignored the beggar at the roadside. These were whispers shaped by fear, not malice, yet they carried enough weight to make the once respected Kelechi a man approached with caution rather than admiration. Wealth drained from his life without pause, slipping through his fingers with the ease of water fleeing open palms, and the abundance he had once treated as proof of his worth began revealing its true nature. Fragile, temporary, and easily lost when not anchored in compassion. Doors that once opened before he could knock now shut in his face with a soft finality that stung sharper than open rejection. Colleagues who once sought his advice now avoided eye contact, unwilling to be tied to a man whose fortune seemed to be sinking under the weight of a fate no one wished to provoke. Even in the marketplace, where laughter and noise filled the air each morning, Kelechi felt a shift in the way people looked at him, some with pity, some with confusion, some with fear, but none with the unshaken respect he had once worn like a shield. He tried to regain control, to cling to the fragments of influence slipping away from him, but every attempt only deepened the sense that something beyond his understanding had turned away from him. Meetings ended abruptly, opportunities dissolved without warning, and friendships he had counted on for years drifted into silence. It was not cruelty he faced. It was emptiness, a quiet abandonment by a world that had once celebrated him, but no longer recognized the man he had become. And yet, despite the collapse unfolding around him, there was something strangely deliberate in the way events aligned, as though each loss was not an act of destruction, but a lesson carved from consequence. From afar, the divine messenger watched each moment with the patient gaze of a teacher rather than an executioner, his presence unseen but unmistakably felt in the way Kelechi's life shifted. The messenger did not intervene to rescue him, nor escalate the unraveling, choosing instead to let the weight of truth guide the young man through a valley he had never imagined entering. It was not punishment that shaped the days, it was instruction, a path designed to strip away everything that hid the deeper parts of who Kelechi truly was beneath layers of ambition and pride. And through it all, Kelechi felt himself shrinking, not in worth, but in certainty, as he confronted the painful revelation that his rise had been built on pillars far more fragile than he ever believed. He had spent years crafting an identity rooted in success, yet now that success slipped away like mist, revealing the hollowness pride had carved within him when compassion was ignored. But even as his world continued to crumble around him, Kelechi had not yet reached the deepest point of his fall. An even harder truth waited in the shadows, ready to meet him where pride could no longer follow. Nights grew unbearably long for Kelechi, stretching into hours that refused to let him rest. Hours filled with the haunting silhouettes of faces he had once passed without a second glance, their eyes lingering in the corners of his mind like echoes of forgotten pleas. Each memory rose sharper than the next, pressing against him with a force far greater than any punishment the world could devise, for no judgment weighs heavier than the realization of one's own neglected humanity. As his wealth slipped away and his reputation dissolved into whispers, Kelechi withdrew into a solitude so profound that even the air inside his home felt different, thicker, quieter, almost mournful. The lavish furnishings he once prized now felt like hollow relics of a life built on shallow victories, and the silence that filled the rooms matched the emptiness settling within him. Without the noise of business, without the presence of admirers, without the comfort of certainty, he found himself face to face with a raw honesty he had long avoided. Regret began to gnaw at him, not with sudden violence, but with slow, relentless persistence, peeling away layers of pride until only the truth remained. He had walked past too many hearts, dismissed too many voices, ignored too many cries. Every night, as exhaustion finally overtook him, the messenger appeared, not in physical form, but within dreams woven with unsettling clarity. He did not speak in anger. He spoke in images, memories, glimpses of moments Kelechi had forgotten or chosen not to see. He showed him the woman he once hurried past as she struggled to carry her basket. He showed him the old farmer he had brushed aside while boasting of his success. He showed him the children whose outstretched hands he had ignored at the market. Each vision struck with quiet precision, reminding him that compassion is not weakness, but the thread that holds the soul intact. Some dreams ended with silence, others with painful stillness, but all left him awakening with a heaviness in his chest that words could not relieve. Slowly, so slowly he barely noticed it at first, humility began to settle into the spaces where pride once ruled. He found his thoughts shifting, revisiting moments he once justified, questioning choices he once celebrated. The ego he had guarded for years loosened its grip, and the fierce determination that had pushed him forward now softened into a willingness to reflect. He began to see that his downfall was not meant to destroy him. It was meant to awaken the parts of him that had been buried beneath ambition. The losses he faced were not punishments. They were mirrors, revealing who he had become and who he still had the chance to be. There were mornings he woke with tears he did not remember shedding, afternoons when he walked through the village unnoticed, feeling the weight of each unnoticed suffering as though it were a personal confession. Evenings when he sat in the marketplace alone, listening to the quiet murmur of life around him in a way he had never allowed himself to do before. And in that listening, he discovered a softness he had forgotten existed, a softness that made his regret heavier, but his understanding sharper. He began recognizing that downfall, in its strange and painful shape, often arrives as the greatest teacher, stripping away illusion until truth stands undeniable. Yet, despite the progress stirring within him, a quiet awareness lingered. There was one final step left to take, one test he could not run from, one moment he had to face without the messenger's dreams or the elder's wisdom to guide him. It was a step that demanded more than reflection. It demanded courage, sincerity, and the willingness to confront the exact place where his fall had begun. And with that realization weighing heavily on his spirit, Kelechi felt a pull, guiding him back toward the place where everything had started. unaware that what awaited him there would shape the man he would become forever. Kelechi stood once more at the dusty roadside, where the beggar had cried out to him weeks ago, and the sight of that familiar stretch of earth made his chest tighten with a remorse so deep it felt stitched into his breath. The memory of that moment, of the trembling hand he ignored, of the whisper he dismissed, of the humanity he refused to see, settled on him heavier than any burden he had ever carried, pressing into him with the quiet force of truth finally acknowledged. He walked slowly to the place where the beggar had sat, the dust rising around his steps like a gentle recognition of his return. Nothing about the road had changed. The same winding path, the same faint smell of clay, the same breeze that carried murmurs from the market. But Kelechi felt unrecognizably different. The arrogance that once shaped his posture had dissolved into humility. The confidence that once stiffened his shoulders now softened into introspection. The pride that once blinded him now unfolded into a painful, necessary clarity. When he reached the exact spot, his legs weakened with the weight of understanding, and he lowered himself to the ground without hesitation, letting his knees sink into the cool dust as though returning to a place of confession. Tears fell freely before he realized he was crying, slipping down his cheeks in quiet surrender as he whispered apologies into the morning air. Apologies for his blindness, for his haste, for the moments he had walked past kindness as though it were a burden rather than a blessing. His voice cracked under the strain of emotion he had never allowed himself to feel, and for a moment the world seemed to pause, listening to the sincerity woven into every word he released into the trembling silence. Kelechi bowed his head, resting his hands against the earth as if seeking forgiveness not from the heavens alone, but from the very ground he once walked across with pride. Then, just as his breath began to steady, a soft tapping sound broke the stillness, a slow measured tap that blended with the wind, yet carried a weight of presence unmistakable to the heart that had finally learned to listen. Kelechi lifted his head, and there he was, the beggar, standing several paces away, leaning once again on his ancient staff, appearing not in radiant glory, but in the same humble form he had worn on the morning that began this transformation. His eyes held a gentleness that pierced Kelechi's soul more deeply than any divine light could have, and when he stepped closer, the air around him settled with a quiet reverence that made the world feel small in comparison. "Now your heart speaks," the messenger said, his voice soft and yet layered with a wisdom that stretched beyond the human. The words carried no reproach, a recognition. Kelechi lowered his gaze, overwhelmed by kneeling in the dust, weeping openly before a humble old stranger. Their uncertainty softened Kelechi's heart even further, and he reached for the small bag he had brought with him, his hands trembling not from weakness, but from sincerity. He opened the bag and pulled out pieces of food, offering them to the children with a gentleness that felt entirely new to him. His hands, once governed by ambition, moved now with compassion alone, and the tremor in his fingers carried more truth than any words he could have spoken. The children accepted the food cautiously at first, then gratefully, their eyes brightening with trust as they sensed the sincerity in his gesture. And in that simple act, kneeling on the same ground he once walked past without care, offering kindness with a heart finally awakened, something shifted around him. The breeze changed direction, the sunlight warmed, and the air thickened with a presence he had felt only inside the hall on the day his pride shattered. And the moment his kindness touched another life, the air stirred once more, subtle yet undeniable, signaling that something greater was already moving toward him again. Light slowly returned to the village square, spreading across the ground with a gentle radiance that seemed to recognize Kelechi before it touched anyone else, settling warmly on his shoulders as though placing a long-awaited blessing where once pride had hardened the heart. It was not the ordinary morning sun, nor the casual warmth of daylight. It felt intentional, like a silent acknowledgement from the world itself that something reborn within him was ready to be seen. And in that soft embrace of light, Kelechi sensed a transformation waiting for confirmation, a new beginning stepping toward him with open hands. The villagers gathered gradually, drawn by the quiet shift in the air that followed Kelechi's act of compassion. They watched in hushed amazement, witnessing a transformation they once believed impossible. The proud man who had once walked the market square, like a force untouchable by humility, now knelt before hungry children, offering them food with patience, tenderness, and a sincerity that made even the most skeptical heart pause. Some villagers exchanged glances filled with disbelief, others with admiration, and some with the humility of those learning that redemption can arrive in the most unexpected forms. They had seen Kelechi rise, they had seen him fall, but none had imagined witnessing the moment he learned to kneel, not as a sign of defeat, but as a pledge to a new way of living. Kelechi continued serving the children one by one, his movements slow and careful, his eyes softened with a gentleness that felt as though it had been waiting beneath his ambition all along. The weight of his past choices still lived within him, but it no longer felt like a chain, only a reminder of the path he must never tread again. For the first time, he saw the village through a different lens, not as a place to conquer, but as a home filled with hearts he had been too blinded to see. His hands, once guided by discipline, meant only for progress, now moved with compassion so natural, it felt as if kindness had always belonged to him, but had simply been hidden by the shadows of pride. Near the edge of the square, the messenger appeared once more, not in dazzling brilliance, not in divine radiance, but in the humble, worn form the villagers recognized. His presence shimmered faintly, as though the boundary between two worlds thinned around him, allowing his essence to flicker softly between realms. Yet there was no intimidation in his posture, no heaviness in his gaze, only approval, quiet and profound, like a teacher watching a student finally discover the lesson written for his soul alone. He stepped closer, the faint glow around him blending with the morning's light, and he spoke in a voice soft enough to feel like a blessing itself. "Blessings return to those who learn their purpose," he whispered, the words carrying through the air with the certainty of truth, older than memory. Kelechi lifted his head slowly, meeting the messenger's gaze with a gratitude that trembled in his breath. And in that exchange, peace settled over him, not the temporary peace of success or achievement, but a deeper stillness, the kind that roots itself inside a person and reshapes every corner of their existence. It was the peace of understanding, of surrender, of knowing that mercy has room even for those who stray far from their own goodness. It filled him with a quiet triumph that needed no audience, no praise, no acknowledgement, only the knowledge that he had finally learned the value of compassion without being asked to prove himself. As the villagers watched this silent moment pass between the messenger and the man they had once admired from afar, they felt a shift within themselves as well. They saw that power meant nothing without humanity, that pride had a price far greater than wealth, and that even the strongest man could rise higher by bending his knee to kindness. In Kelechi's transformation, they witnessed not only his restoration, but also a reminder of what their community could become when guided by mercy rather than judgment. The messenger's glow began to fade softly, dissolving into the morning light until his silhouette blended seamlessly with the world around him. Kelechi watched as the divine presence receded, not with sorrow, but with reverence, feeling the blessing settle into him like a seed planted deep within the soil of his reborn heart. His future no longer rested on ambition, but on the compassion he had finally embraced, and for the first time, the horizon ahead felt not like a battleground, but like an unwritten promise. Yet even as peace wrapped itself around him, something in the air hinted that destiny had more in store, waiting quietly, patiently, just beyond the horizon of this new beginning. If this story moved your heart, then let your journey with us continue. because every tale we share carries a lesson waiting to awaken something within you. Subscribe to the channel and stay with us as we uncover more powerful African stories filled with destiny, wisdom, and transformation. Your likes, comments, and support help these stories reach those who need them most. Join this community and let every new episode remind you of the strength that lives in compassion and the destinies shaped by a single choice: